The Turner Ranch, once a proud and prosperous spread of land nestled in the Golden Hills of Wyoming Territory, now stood on the edge of ruin. What had once been 1,500 acres of fertile pasture, filled with the sound of lowing cattle and hard-working men, was now quite eerily so. The fences sagged, several barns had fallen into disrepair, and the drought-hardened earth cracked underfoot. It was the kind of silence that followed loss, not just of life, but of spirit. Caleb Turner, the owner and widower, bore the weight of that silence like a yoke around his neck. His wife Eliza had died 6 months earlier of pneumonia, a swift and merciless illness that had taken her in the dead of winter. The land hadn't recovered. Neither had Caleb. He'd once been a man of vigor and resolve, with broad shoulders, a sharp jaw, and a quiet strength that commanded respect without a single boast. But grief had hollowed him out. These days he rode less, spoke little, and barely touched the books that tracked the ranch's declining profits. His days passed in a blur of labor and avoidance. At night he sat in the empty parlor nursing a bottle of rye, pretending he didn't notice how empty the house felt without Eliza's voice echoing off the walls. But grief wasn't the only enemy pressing in. The ranch's finances were in shambles. After Eliza's death, the ranch hands began to leave one by one. Some out of pity, some out of fear, and others simply for better wages elsewhere. Caleb had refused help, too proud to accept charity from neighboring ranchers and too withdrawn to hire replacements. With fewer hands, the cattle went untended, the fields underworked, and the income dwindled to a trickle. Then came the letters notices from the bank and from his late father's lawyer. Turns out his inheritance was conditional. His father, a shrewd man who valued legacy and continuity, had written a clause into the will years before. Caleb had to be legally married by the first anniversary of his father's death, or ownership of the Turner Ranch would revert to the state and the land, auctioned off. There were only 4 weeks left. Caleb had stared at that letter for days, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. His heart, still tethered to Eliza's memory, couldn't fathom the idea of marrying someone else, let alone so soon. But logic tugged at him like a lead-weighted lasso. The ranch was his birthright, his legacy. Without it, he was nothing. And with no heirs, no children, and no plan, he was running out of time and options. To make matters worse, Silas Granger, a ruthless land baron who had been trying to buy out the Turner Ranch for over a decade, had caught wind of Caleb's trouble. Granger's men had been seen loitering near the southern pastures, taking note of boundaries, cattle counts, and water sources. Granger knew the ranch's value, and more importantly, he knew its vulnerability. If Caleb didn't act soon, Granger wouldn't need to negotiate. He could simply outweight him. In the middle of this storm stood the ranch house cook, Annie Harper. Annie had been working in the Turner household for over 2 years, first as a working in the Turner household for over 2 years, first as a Annie household, for us as a peven working in the Turner household, kitchen maid, then stepping into the cook's role when the older woman who trained her retired and moved east. She was not refined, not society polished, but she was known for her no-nonsense attitude and sharp tongue. A sturdy woman in her late 20s, she was used to being overlooked, underestimated, and underappreciated. Still, she stayed. For the steady income. For the freedom. For reasons even she didn't fully understand. And now she was one of the last remaining employees. She saw the way Caleb struggled, though he tried to hide it. She cooked his meals, washed the dishes he left untouched, and watched him sink deeper into silence each day. She wasn't in love with the man, but she respected him, pitied him even. And when she overheard the lawyer's letter being read aloud from the parlor, she knew things were worse than she imagined. The Turner Ranch wasn't just dying, It was being left to rot. The first part of this story doesn't bring romance or redemption. It brings survival and the harsh reminder that land, once taken for granted, can be lost as quickly as love. Caleb Turner may have been a widowed rancher with no heart left to give, but the land still beat beneath his boots, pulsing with the memory of generations past. And somewhere deep in that land's roots, something was waiting to grow if only he could find the strength to plant it. The morning the lawyer arrived, the air was thick with dust and heat. Summer had come early to the Turner Ranch, and the sky above was already a blinding, cloudless white. Caleb stood on the porch with his arms folded across his chest as the carriage pulled up the long drive. Kicking gravel in its wake. Mr. Nathaniel Briggs, his father's old attorney, stepped out in a dark, well-pressed suit far too formal for Wyoming terrain. He removed his hat, nodded, and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. "You're late," Caleb said flatly. Briggs offered a tired smile. "And you're still a man of few words, I see." They sat at the kitchen table. Annie had left out coffee, though she didn't linger. She knew when to stay scarce, especially when money or law came through the door. Caleb listened with a stony expression as Briggs unfolded a stack of yellowed documents, speaking in his clipped, officious tone. "Your father had a vision for the ranch's legacy, Caleb. He always spoke of bloodlines, heirs, and stewardship. That's why he put conditions in the will." "I've heard this already," Caleb muttered. "You've heard the summary," Briggs corrected. "Now you'll hear the details." He slid the legal paper across the table and tapped it with a gloved finger. Clause 19. The heir to Turner Ranch must be legally wed within 1 year of George Turner's death. Otherwise, the ranch and all holdings are to be surrendered to the state for auction. Caleb didn't touch the paper. "You think I haven't read that a dozen times? Then you understand the gravity." Briggs leaned forward. "The deadline is August 3rd. 26 days from today." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Eliza's barely cold in the ground," Briggs softened. "I know. I liked Eliza. She brought light to this house. But this isn't about grief or time. It's about your father's will. He should have kept his nose out of my life. He thought he was preserving it." Caleb stood abruptly and turned toward the window. Outside, the cattle moved sluggishly in the sun, their numbers halved since last year. In the distance, dust clouds marked the roads where Granger's men patrolled. The ranch was dying, and his father's damn stipulation was the final nail in the coffin. "You know what's ironic?" he said quietly. "All that talk about legacy. But the old man never asked if I even wanted children." Briggs rose as well, his voice gentler now. "Do you?" Caleb didn't answer. The lawyer left that afternoon, leaving behind a copy of the will and a bitter taste in Caleb's mouth. As the sun dipped low, he found himself walking the property, boots crunching over brittle grass. The ranch had always been his sanctuary. He'd been born here, bled here, and loved here. But now, it was just a shadow of what it used to be like him. He didn't want to remarry. Not like this. Not for a contract, yet something inside him, call it pride, call it desperation, refused to let the land go without a fight. That night, he sat in the dining room long after the food had grown cold. Annie entered quietly to clear the table. Moving efficiently, her sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. "You knew, didn't you?" he asked suddenly. She paused. "About the will?" He nodded. "I overheard Mr. Briggs last time he was here," she said carefully, not meeting his eyes. "Didn't mean to eavesdrop, but paper walls don't hide much." He grunted, then leaned back in his chair. "What would you do if this place was yours and you had to marry someone just to keep it?" Annie looked at him, then really looked. "Depends," she said. "Am I marrying a man or marrying the land?" Caleb smirked. "Just barely. You always talk like that?" only when the conversation's dangerous. They stared at each other for a long, silent moment. For the first time, Caleb saw something other than practicality in her eyes. He saw fire, grit, loyalty. She wasn't soft like Eliza had been. Annie was forged of something harder, shaped by kitchen heat and solitude. But she knew this ranch. She understood the rhythms of the land, the work, the seasons. She was part of it in a way that no stranger could be. The idea sparked quietly, hesitantly. Could it work? Could a marriage built on survival turn into something more? He didn't know. But with 26 days left and every other option gone, one thing became painfully clear. If he was going to save the ranch, he'd need a wife, and the only one left standing was Annie Harper. Annie Harper had never been the kind of woman people looked at twice at least, not the way they looked at Eliza Turner. Where Eliza had been delicate and graceful, with fine fingers made for piano keys and embroidery, Annie was broad-shouldered, sun-tanned and calloused from years of kneading dough and hauling firewood. She knew her worth in the kitchen, not in a ballroom. Her hands might not have played music, but they'd kept half this ranch alive long before Caleb Turner noticed her for anything beyond the breakfast table, and now he was noticing. Annie felt it in the way he watched her when she spoke. She caught him lingering by the kitchen door a second longer than he used to, and when he asked her that strange question, "What would you do?" she'd felt a shift in the air. A line being drawn, or maybe erased. She told herself it didn't matter. Whatever Caleb Turner was thinking, it had nothing to do with love, and she'd long since stopped hoping for that. Anyway, Annie had grown up in Wyoming territory with a drunk father and a mother who vanished one winter's night and never returned. By 14, she was scrubbing floors at a boarding house. By 20, she'd followed rumors of a cook's job out west and landed at the Turner Ranch hungry for steady work and somewhere to belong. She got the work. The belonging never came. Eliza had been kind enough, but there'd always been a quiet line drawn between family and staff. Annie knew her place. She never ate at the big table, never used the front door, and certainly never expected anyone to ask her opinion about the ranch, the finances, or the future. But she watched. She listened. She learned and in those 6 months since Eliza's death, Annie had seen the ranch falter and Caleb flounder. The staff disappeared one by one. The larder grew bare, and Annie began doing double-duty cooking, cleaning, even keeping tally on the pantry stock when no one else would. She stayed not out of loyalty to Caleb Turner, but out of something deeper. She loved this land. Not in the romantic way the men did, not for conquest or cattle drives. She loved it like a heartbeat under her boots, a rhythm she understood. Night, long after the dinner dishes had been scrubbed and the embers in the stove burned low, Caleb appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. His hat in hand, his hair mussed, and his eyes darker than usual. "Got a question," he said. Annie didn't look up from the potatoes she was peeling for the morning. "Then ask it. You ever thought about getting married?" She snorted. "Not since I was 17 and a stagehand tried to kiss me with whiskey on his breath. I'm serious. So am I." She dropped another potato into the basin. "Why?" He shifted awkwardly. "Because I need a wife, fast, and I don't have the time or the heart to chase down someone from town." Annie turned to face him, her knife still in hand. "So you figured, what? I'm close by, not too ugly, and already do the cooking?" Caleb had the grace to flinch. "That's not, save it." She tossed the towel aside. "You're talking about a business deal, not a marriage." "Is that so bad?" She crossed her arms. "And what do I get out of it, besides your name?" His eyes met hers. "A roof, a share of the land, half if you want it." That made her blink. "Half the Turner Ranch?" He nodded. "If I lose it, you lose it too. So you'd be invested. And I need someone who gives a damn about this place." Annie stared at him, heart-pounding. It wasn't the proposal every woman dreamed of. There were no flowers, no vows of love. Just a desperate man offering survival in exchange for a signature and a name on a ledger. But it was more than she'd ever been offered before. She turned back to the basin and picked up another potato. "All right," she said quietly. "But I have my own conditions." Caleb raised a brow. "Name them." "No pretending, no expectations. We do this to save the ranch, nothing more. You don't owe me affection, and I won't play house for your neighbors." "Fair enough." "And if we make this deal," she said, voice low but firm, "you treat me as your equal, not your servant, not your pity case." Caleb nodded slowly. "Done." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling around them. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was a start. And in a place like this, where land meant everything and time was running out, that was all either of them could afford to hope for. The next morning dawned overcast. The sky, hanging low and heavy as if it too felt the weight of what had been agreed the night before. The wind blew sharp across the prairie, bending the grasses like the ranch itself, resilient but tired. Caleb Turner stood at the fence line, hat pulled low, eyes scanning the land that still belonged to him for now. Behind him, boots crunched. "Over dry earth. You sure about this?" Annie's voice was steady, but there was a flicker of tension beneath it, like a string pulled tight. Caleb turned. "You change your mind?" She shrugged. "No, but I'd like to know what I'm walking into." He gestured to the house, and they walked together in silence, each step a beat closer to something neither fully understood. In the parlor, the documents lay open on the table: marriage license papers, property agreements, and an unsigned deed drafted with freshly inked names: Caleb Turner and Annie Harper. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee, one for each of them. No cream, no sugar, just bitter, hot truth. "I had Briggs draw up the legal paperwork," Caleb said. "It's all there. The land splits clean, half mine, half yours. No tricks, no hidden language. You sign, we marry, the ranch stays in our hands." Annie studied the papers, her brows furrowing. "That easy, huh?" "It's legal, not easy." She tapped a finger against the marriage license. "And this part? You figure we just say a few words, shake hands, and call it done?" "There's a preacher 2 towns over. Owes me a favor. He won't ask questions." Annie let out a soft breath, somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "Romantic." Caleb looked at her carefully. "I'm not asking for romance, Annie. No, you're not. You're asking for a partner who'll take on your dying ranch, risk her name and reputation, and tie herself to a man still in love with his dead wife." Caleb flinched. "I'm not blind, Caleb," she added more softly. "I know who Eliza was to you." He looked away, jaw clenched. "She was everything, but she's gone. And if I don't do this, if we don't do this, everything she helped me build goes with her." Annie nodded, her expression unreadable. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried or clung. But inside, her heart rattled against her ribs like a pan on a hook during a storm, because this wasn't just a proposal of land and paper. It was a gamble. If it went wrong, she'd lose more than her job. She'd lose the only home she'd ever really known. And yet, this was a chance. A dangerous, foolish, possibly life-ruining chance. But hers. "All right," she said, pulling out the chair. "Let's go over the terms." They spent the next hour drafting their own agreement, one separate from the legal contracts. A private understanding of what they were stepping into. Annie's conditions. She would have full say in the management of the ranch, especially the kitchen, staff, and livestock supply. She wouldn't be expected to share a bed unless that. changed by mutual decision, no pressure, no pretense, no secrets. If they were to be partners, there would be honesty, even if it was difficult. Caleb's conditions. They'd present a united front to outsiders' neighbors, townsfolk, and especially Silas Granger. Annie would be legally protected. If the marriage failed or he passed, her stake in the ranch would remain. They would try not for love, but for respect, for trust. That would be the foundation. Annie signed first. Her signature was firm. Neat, a statement in black ink that said, "I'm here. I matter." Caleb signed next. His handwriting was a bit heavier, the kind of scrawl worn down by years of ledgers and receipts. When the last stroke of the pen dried, they sat back in silence. "That's it then," Annie said quietly. Caleb looked at her across the table. "We ride to town tomorrow. Say the words. Make it official. And after that, we come back, saddle up, and save this ranch." She gave him a faint smile, wry, but real. "You make it sound simple. It won't be." His eyes were tired, but steady. "But it'll be ours." Annie rose, gathered the papers, and tucked them into a satchel beside the door. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't have to. Caleb watched her go, unsure whether he just made the smartest deal of his life or the biggest mistake. Outside, the wind kicked up dust again. But this time, it carried something else to momentum. They weren't husband and wife yet, but the deal was struck, and everything would change from here. The wedding took less than 10 minutes. They rode to the dusty town of Dry Creek before the sun had fully risen, the sky still painted in faint orange streaks. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt, still frayed at the cuffs, and Annie had tied back her hair with a blue ribbon she hadn't worn since Eliza's funeral. It wasn't for show. It was simply the only nice thing she owned. The preacher, a tired man named Reverend Wallace, met them in the back room of the chapel, his eyes flickering between the two of them as he tried to make sense of what exactly. This was a marriage? A deal? A desperate act? But Caleb Turner had always been the kind of man folks didn't question. He spoke plainly, paid on time, and carried quiet authority. So when he asked the Reverend to keep things quick and private, Wallace simply nodded and began the ceremony. There were no flowers, no rings, no music, no vows beyond the legal ones required by the territory. "Do you, Caleb Turner, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" "I do." "Do you, Annie Harper, take this man to be your lawful husband?" A pause. "I do." And that was it. No kiss. No hand-holding. Just signatures, a nod, and a quiet dismissal. They left the chapel as Mr. and Mrs. Turner, but there was no celebration waiting for them, only silence and the long ride back to the ranch, with the wind howling across the open plain like it, too, disapproved. Back at the ranch house, the mood was heavy. Caleb went straight to the barn without a word, tending to a lame colt that had been favoring its leg for days. Annie stood in the kitchen, unsure whether she should cook for one or two. She finally fried up potatoes and bacon and left both plates on the table. He didn't come. That night, they occupied the same house as husband and wife, but not the same room. Caleb slept in the master bedroom he'd once shared with Eliza, though he didn't sleep much at all. The room still smelled faintly of her perfume. Her comb sat untouched on the vanity. He hadn't had the strength to clear it out, and now he didn't know whether to feel ashamed or comforted that Annie hadn't asked him to. Annie, meanwhile, had moved into the small guest room near the back of the house. It had no windows, one creaky bed, and a wardrobe with a broken hinge, but it was hers now. For the first time, she didn't feel like a maid sleeping off duty. She was here by name, by paper, and by claim. Still, it felt more like occupying a space than belonging to it. Neither of them spoke much the next day, or the one after. A week passed in silence and routine. The ranch demanded too much work for them to sit and reflect on their awkward union. Fences needed mending. A calf went missing. The water troughs dried out faster in the heat, and a storm was on the horizon. In public, they acted the part. When they rode into town for supplies, Annie wore a bonnet and kept close to Caleb's side. People whispered, of course. Some pitied her. Others smirked, assuming she'd trapped a widower into marriage for a slice of land. No one guessed the truth, that she'd entered into this arrangement with clear eyes and no promises. But the quiet was beginning to wear. One night, after a long day of branding cattle under an unforgiving sun, Annie stood in the kitchen scrubbing dishes harder than she needed to. Caleb walked in, dusty and worn. "You don't have to keep cooking like you're still the help," he said. Annie didn't look up. Force of habit. He moved closer, unsure whether to sit or leave. "You all right?" She dried her hands on her apron and turned. "We've been married a week and you've barely said more than 10 words to me. I'd say I'm exactly as all right as you are." A long pause. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Do what?" "Talk to your wife?" "I don't know how to be married to someone I don't love." Annie nodded, her jaw tight. "Well, that makes 2 of us." It wasn't meant to be cruel, just honest, and maybe that honesty chipped something loose between them. They stood in that tension, not as strangers anymore, but not yet partners. Somewhere in between, trying to make peace with a union built on necessity, not affection. "I don't expect love, Caleb," she said finally, "but I do expect respect. And conversation wouldn't kill you. You're right." His eyes met hers, weary but sincere. "I'll try," she gave a small nod. "Good." And that night, for the first time, Caleb sat across from her at the table and ate the food she'd made. They didn't say much, but it was a beginning. A cold one, yes, but beginnings always are. The wind shifted the day Silas Granger showed up at the edge of the Turner Ranch. It wasn't unusual for Granger to make his presence known. He owned more land than anyone in 3 counties, and he liked to remind people of it. But ever since word had spread about Caleb Turner's sudden marriage to the cook girl, Granger's interest had turned from casual curiosity to unsettling intent. He came in a polished black buggy, pulled by 2 fine-blooded horses that had no business kicking up the dust of a struggling ranch. Dressed in a charcoal waistcoat and gold watch chain that gleamed even in the clouded sun, Granger looked every inch the predator he was. Caleb watched him approach from the front porch, arms folded, eyes hard. Annie stood behind the window curtain, silent. She had a bad feeling. Granger tipped his hat with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Morning, Turner. Heard congratulations were in order." Caleb didn't smile. "Not taking visitors today." "Well, I ain't exactly a visitor. I'm an investor. Not in my land, you're not." Granger's grin widened. Yet. They spoke for 15 tense minutes on the porch, and though the words were civil, Annie could feel the sharpness behind them like fencing with knives wrapped in velvet. Granger asked about the cattle, about water rights, about how the recent drought was affecting harvest projections. His tone was polite, but his meaning was clear. He knew the ranch was weak. He sniffed out vulnerability like a wolf scents blood. And then, as if just remembering something, he said, "Can't help but be curious about the new Mrs. Turner. Quite the surprise that she was the cook, wasn't she? Interesting choice. Some folks might say, desperate." Caleb's mouth twitched, but he didn't rise to it. "You mind your business, Granger, and I'll mind mine." "Oh, I am. I always do," Granger said, turning to leave. "Just keep in mind marriages done in haste tend to unravel faster than old rope. And when that happens, someone always winds up in the dirt." He climbed into his buggy and disappeared in a trail of dust. That night, Annie found Caleb in the barn, sharpening tools by lantern light. She didn't speak right away, just leaned on the wall and watched him work. "I saw him," she said after a moment, from the window. Caleb didn't stop sharpening. "Granger's a vulture, smells decay a mile off. And he thinks this marriage is fake." He glanced up. "Isn't it?" The question hit her harder than she expected. "Maybe, but it's still ours." They were quiet for a while. Then Caleb finally put the tool down and looked at her. "He's going to push. Maybe more than push. He wants the land, and if he thinks he can use you to get to me, he'll try." Annie crossed her arms. "Let him. I've been threatened by worse than some slick-haired land baron." Caleb studied her, and something shifted in his expression. Pride, maybe. Or respect. Either way, it lingered. "Still," he said, "you should be careful." 2 days later, Granger returned, but not to the ranch this time. He went to town. Annie found out from Doris Hensley, the dressmaker's wife, when she and Caleb rode in to restock feed. Doris, who never passed up a piece of gossip, leaned in with wide eyes and whispered, "Granger's been sniffing around the courthouse, asking about your marriage license. Wanted to know if it was filed properly, if the ink was even dry." Annie's face went cold. "Why would he care?" Doris smirked. "Because he smells blood in the water, honey. He thinks if he can prove your marriage ain't real, he can break the will, take the land. Just thought you ought to know." That night, Caleb paced in the parlor, fists clenched. "He's trying to undo us," he said. "Piece by piece." Annie sat by the window, arms wrapped around herself. "Then let him try. We know the truth." "Do we?" She looked at him. "I don't know what this is." "Between us, Caleb, but I signed those papers. I stood in front of that preacher. I said yes when you asked, and I didn't do it for show. I did it because I care about this land as much as you do." His eyes softened. "I know, and if he wants to test me, let him. I won't flinch." Caleb stepped closer, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough to let something vulnerable through. "You know what I realized when I saw him on my porch?" "What?" "That I wasn't afraid of losing the ranch. Not really. I was afraid he'd take it from you." Annie blanked. "Why?" "Because this land was always mine. But now it feels like it's ours." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Instead, she stood, walked over, and placed her hand on his chest just briefly. Just enough to let him feel her presence. They still slept in separate rooms that night, but it was the first time Caleb laid in bed and imagined her beside him, not out of obligation, but out of choice. It started with thunder, the kind that rolled low and long across the plains like a warning. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and the wind had picked up, sharp and wild. Caleb stood by the barn, watching the clouds. Churn, tension crawling up his spine like the scent of rain in dry air. Storm's gonna be rough. He muttered. Annie stood beside him, her skirt whipping around her legs. "Cattle'll panic if they're not tied down." "I'll handle the herd," he said. "You get the chickens and latch the cellar." Annie didn't argue. They both knew what storms could do out here: floods, torn fences, lightning strikes. When the weather turned mean in Wyoming, you worked fast or you lost everything. They moved like clockwork, shouting over the rising wind. Caleb rode out to the pasture, driving the cattle toward the holding pen. Annie dashed between the coops and the back porch, pulling down laundry, roping the hens into their shelter, covering barrels and feed sacks. The first crack of lightning split the sky as they both ducked into the barn. And then the downpour. Rain hit the roof like hammer blows, deafening, relentless. Thunder cracked so hard it shook the walls. They were both soaked, boots muddy, breathing hard, adrenaline still pulsing through them. Caleb pulled the doors shut, barring them from the inside. "Storm came faster than I thought," he said, wiping water from his brow. You and every other man who tries to predict nature, Annie muttered, wringing out her braid. He looked at her, then really looked. Rain streamed down her face, her cheeks flushed, hair dark and clinging to her neck. There was dirt on her dress, a scrape on her forearm, and a fire in her eyes that no thunder could put out. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. She met his gaze. "I've been through worse." Lightning flashed. The moment held. Then she added, "Though I wouldn't mind a fire and a dry pair of socks." Caleb chuckled, surprising them both. They sat down on overturned crates near the hay. The horses in the stalls stomped nervously, but Annie calmed them with soft words and gentle hands. She had a way about her, not gentle, exactly, but grounding. Solid. He watched her move, and something shifted inside him. Not just respect, not just gratitude, something else. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, his voice half lost in the sound of rain. She paused. "Used to. When I first came here, I figured it'd be temporary. Thought I'd earn enough to move east, maybe open a bakery or a boarding house. Something small. But you stayed." "I stayed," she echoed. He nodded slowly. "You could have gone after Eliza died. Nobody would have blamed you." "I didn't stay for pity, Caleb. I know." Silence stretched between them. Not awkward but heavy, like something unspoken hovered in the air. "Why did you really ask me to marry you?" she said suddenly, eyes locked on his. "Not just to keep the ranch," he swallowed. "I needed someone who wouldn't run. Someone who knew this land, knew me, and wouldn't be scared off by hard times. And he stopped, shook his head, and, "What?" she pressed, quieter now. I was tired of being alone." The honesty in his voice surprised them both. Annie looked away, her throat tight. "I've been alone a long time, too." Lightning lit up the barn again, followed by a crash so loud the horses reared. Annie jumped, losing her balance, and Caleb reached out instinctively, his hand catching her waist, pulling her steady. For a heartbeat, they didn't move, his hands on her hips, her breath catching. Faces close. Too close. "Annie." "I know," she whispered. He didn't kiss her, but he wanted to, and she didn't pull away. The storm passed after midnight. When they returned to the house, dripping and tired, neither said a word about what had happened in the barn. But the air had changed between them, around them. It was no longer just a transaction. No longer a cold alliance sealed in ink. There was heat now, flickering at the edges. They still slept in separate rooms. But as Annie lay in her small bed, eyes wide open in the dark, she no longer felt like a stranger in someone else's home. And in the master bedroom, Caleb lay awake, replaying the sound of her laughter echoing in the barn, remembering the feel of her waist under his hands. A storm had passed, but something far more dangerous had started to stir, something neither of them was quite ready to name, not yet. The storm had cleared the air, but it didn't bring peace. Days that followed were filled with long, hot hours of cleanup. Fallen branches, damaged fencing, debris washed into the pasture. Caleb and Annie worked side by side, unspoken tension thickening between them, not the cold kind anymore, but something warmer, tighter. Something alive. And then things started to go wrong. Not just little things, not weather things. Intentional things. First, it was the cattle feed, 2 whole barrels gone sour overnight. Annie opened one and gagged at the stench. This wasn't rot, she told Caleb. It was poisoned. Caleb's eyes darkened. "You sure? I've been around food my whole life." "Someone did this." 2 days later, the south pasture gate was found wide open at dawn. 3 head of cattle had wandered off. One had broken a leg in the arroyo and had to be put down. The next morning, someone had cut the water line to the well trough. Sliced clean. No animal could have done it. Sabotage. Caleb said grimly, staring down at the split pipe. Annie didn't disagree. And she didn't need to guess who was behind it. Silas Granger. He couldn't take the ranch through legal channels, not while the marriage held. So now he was trying to force failure, one piece at a time. Make the land useless. Drive the livestock away. And maybe, if he got lucky, drive a wedge between Caleb and Annie too. The tension boiled over 3 nights. Later, Caleb had gone into town for wire and supplies. Annie stayed behind, mending linens by lamplight and keeping an eye on the kitchen, the barn, the fences, everything. At sundown, there was a knock at the back door. She opened it to find Silas Granger, alone, hat in hand, a slow smile on his lips. "Evenin', Miss Harper." Or should I say, Mrs. Turner? Annie stiffened. "You're trespassing." Granger ignored the comment. "I thought I'd drop in for a neighborly chat. We're not neighbors. You're a parasite with a pocket full of lawyers." His smile didn't falter. "Still got that sharp tongue, I see. No wonder Caleb married you. Nothing like a woman who knows how to bite. Say what you came to say and leave." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We both know this marriage isn't built to last. Man like Caleb? He'll never really see you. You'll always be the cook who stepped in when the lady of the house died." Annie didn't flinch. "You know what I think?" Granger continued. "I think you're smart enough to cut your losses. You sign a statement, say the marriage was a sham. Say Caleb forced you into it, and I'll make it worth your while." "How worth it? A little cabin up north, clean land, no debt. Your own place, your own name. No more scrubbing pots for a man who barely speaks to you." Annie stared at him, long and steady. Then she stepped back, lifted the shotgun from behind the door frame, and cocked it. "You have 5 seconds to get off this porch before I show you just how sharp that tongue of mine really is." Granger's expression twisted something between amusement and contempt. "So that's a no then? That's a go to hell." He tipped his hat and backed away slowly. "Suit yourself. But you're making a mistake." She shut the door in his face. When Caleb returned an hour later, muddy and tired, Annie met him in the yard, shotgun still in hand. He froze. "What happened?" Granger showed up, tried to buy me off. Caleb's fists clenched. "Did he touch you?" "No," she said. "But he wanted me to lie. Say the marriage wasn't real." "And what did you say?" She looked up at him, eyes fierce and steady. "I said I'd rather go down with this ranch than betray it, than betray you." The words hit him like a slap and a balm all at once. He took a step closer. "Why, Annie?" "Because you trusted me," she said. "You gave me a name, a stake. You gave me something I've never had in my whole life, a place that was mine. And I'm not letting some coward in a fine coat take that away." The silence between them crackled like a storm cloud ready to burst. "I should have told you sooner," Caleb said, voice low. "This started as survival, but it's more than that now." Annie swallowed hard. "You mean that?" He nodded. Every word. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she stepped forward and rested her palm on his chest right over his heart. "Then let's fight like we mean it." And in that moment, they weren't just partners by law or necessity. We're a united front. The ranch was still broken in places, fences to mend, money stretched thin, threats still circling like buzzards overhead, but something inside the house had changed. Caleb noticed it in the mornings, when Annie no longer waited for him to speak first over breakfast. She just talked about the weather, the feed schedule, what needed fixing in the barn, and he listened. Not out of obligation, but because he wanted to hear her voice. She noticed it in the evenings, when he'd sit at the table with her after supper instead of retreating to the porch. Sometimes he helped her dry the dishes. Sometimes they just sat in the quiet. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden sweeping kiss. But the distance between them began to shrink. They started laughing. lightly, awkwardly at first. Annie had a sharp wit, and Caleb had a dry sense of humor that rarely surfaced. But when it did, it made her smile linger longer than she meant it to. He began watching her differently, not just with appreciation for her work, but with growing affection for the woman behind the strength. The way her brow creased when she was measuring flour. The way she tied her hair up with a worn ribbon that matched nothing else she owned. The way she hummed sometimes when she thought no one was listening. And Annie? She started noticing the man behind the silence. Caleb was still grieving. Yes, but she saw how hard he worked to keep his pain from defining him. How he stopped drinking. Alone at night. How he made room for her, not just in the house, but in his life. There were no more separate rooms. One night, after a long day of fence repair, Annie emerged from the washroom in her nightdress, barefoot, hair damp. Caleb stood in the hallway, just outside the master bedroom, holding the door open, not demanding, not asking Dot, just waiting. And she walked in. That night. They lay in the bed, not touching it first, just lying side by side in the dark, listening. To each other breathe. After a long silence, Caleb spoke. "You scare me, Annie." She turned toward him. Why? Because this was never supposed to feel like this. She reached for his hand. "It's not fear, Caleb. It's hope. You just don't recognize it yet." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Not. Because he had to. Because he wanted to. The next morning the world didn't change. The cow still needed feeding. Granger was still a problem. The money still wasn't right. But when Annie walked out onto the porch with her coffee, Caleb reached over and laced his fingers through hers as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Later that week, they rode into town together, shoulders squared, heads high, married in name and spirit now. The whispers started again, but they no longer cared. Because those who stared saw something different. Now, not a man who married beneath him. Not a woman who'd settled for survival, but a couple who had fought for something real. One afternoon, Reverend Wallace stopped by with a bundle of papers and a curious smile. "Just wanted to bring by an updated copy of your marriage certificate," he said. "Someone reported a clerical error. Seems your paperwork got misplaced down at the courthouse." Caleb took the papers and frowned. "Granger?" The Reverend shrugged. "Probably. But it won't matter now. Everything's official. Solid. Even Silas Granger's lawyer can't crack through it." He looked at Annie, who stood beside Caleb with her arms crossed. "You two made it real, didn't you?" Annie smiled. "It's been real since the storm." Wallace tipped his hat. "Well then, God bless." Later that night, they sat together on the porch as the sun dipped low over the horizon. The land stretched before them, scarred but healing, just like them. "You think we'll make it?" Annie asked. "With the ranch?" "With us." Caleb looked out over the fields, where the wind rustled through the grass like a whisper of old stories and new promises. "I think we already have," he said. "Because this," he turned to her, "this was never just about the land." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "No," she agreed. "It was about choosing to stay." When? Leaving would have been easier. They sat that way until the stars came out, hand in hand, no longer bound by a contract, but by something stronger. Love, loyalty, and the land they'd saved together. Spring arrived late that year, as if the land itself had been waiting, watching, to see if Caleb and Annie would survive the long winter of hardship and change. But when it came with color and courage. Wildflowers bloomed where scorched grass once lay. Fences stood tall again, patched with care and grit. The well flowed clean. And in the low fields near the barn, new calves kicked at the sun. The ranch, once on the verge of collapse, was alive again. So where they Annie stood barefoot in the early light, apron tied around her waist, sipping coffee. On the porch she now called hers. The wind caught the hem of her skirt, and she didn't bother to fix it. The land stretched out in front of her, gold and green, kissed by dawn. Behind her, Caleb stepped out, shirt half buttoned, still drying his hands with a towel. His hair was damp and he looked more rested than he had in months, maybe years. "You? Always up this early?" he asked. "I used to be up earlier," she said, "before I had someone to share coffee with." He smiled and walked over, resting his hand at her lower back. "You still think about leaving sometimes?" She turned to look at him. "No, not anymore. This place. It's part of me now." He nodded. "I was thinking it might be time to make it official." She blinked. "We're already married, Caleb. I know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, weathered, wooden, simple. When she opened it, she saw a gold ring nestled in the blue velvet with a modest stone. Nothing flashy, just solid and beautiful, like everything else he did. "This time," he said quietly, "I want it to be because we choose it. Not because of the land, not because of the bank. Just because it's you and me." Annie stared at the ring for a long moment, heart full, hands trembling. "You're not much for speeches, are you?" she whispered. "Nope, but I mean every word." She took the ring and slipped it on herself. "Good, because you're stuck with me now." They invited the town, though neither of them wanted a fuss. The wedding was held under the big oak tree on the ridge above the ranch house, the same place where Caleb had once stood with Eliza. Annie worried that it would feel like a shadow, like she was standing in someone else's memory. But when she walked down the path in a pale blue dress, and Caleb looked up with a gaze that held only her, the past gently stepped aside and let the present bloomed out. Reverend Wallace kept it short. "They've already done the hard part," he said with a wink. "Now they get to do the rest together." Afterward, there was laughter and dancing on the dirt-packed yard, lemonade and pie, a fiddle and a fire. Kids chased dogs, old ranch. Hands swapped stories, and for the first time in a long time, the place felt full. Caleb held Annie close as the sun set, her head against his chest, his arms firm around her waist. "You think we did it?" he asked Dot. She looked up at him. "I think we're just getting started." In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm neither of them had known before, not one of mere survival, but of partnership. Annie planted a garden by the side of the house. Caleb built her a bench beneath the old apple tree. They talked, late into the evenings, about the ranch, the future, maybe even children someday. They no longer feared Silas Granger. After Annie's rejection and Caleb's counter-threat of legal action, Granger had backed off for good. Word around town was that his attention had shifted to oil speculation out west. Let him chase ghosts, because here, on this land this earned, fought for, loved land, a different kind of legacy, was being built, not of wealth or power, but of roots. Of healing, of choosing to stay, one night. Long after the house had gone quiet and the stars had taken their posts above the plains, Annie stood on the porch again, Caleb's arm draped around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled. "That girl in the cookhouse. The one nobody saw coming." He kissed the top of her head. "She saved the ranch." She looked up at him. "No, we did." He nodded, and for a moment there was only the sound of the wind in the grass, the creak of the old swing, and the certainty between them. The marriage may have started as necessity, but it had become the truest kind of love. There is a love born from loyalty, forged in hardship, chosen every day. And like the land they stood on, it would weather every storm to come together.